Brothers and sisters loved in Christ, where do you go in your time of need? You know, when you're lost, when you're confused, when you're afraid, where do you turn? You know, I confess that when I feel lost, confused, or afraid by the situation I'm in, I often turn to myself. I turn to other people. I turn to other things. I try to find ways to get myself out of the situation by doing that, and I often try to escape the consequences of my actions by somehow doing that, going to myself, going to others, going to other things. How can I limit the consequences of the trouble I'm in? And then, when all of my other actions don't work, then I go to the Lord. Now, some have argued that that's what David's doing in 1 Samuel 21 and 22. You know, one commentator put it this way: David's reliance on his own cunning has clouded his eye of faith. And the point is that David's relying on himself, and he's doing all kinds of stuff that's wrong. And there's disastrous consequences. If you read ahead after if you keep reading in 1 Samuel 22, you're going to see that because of what David does in the text we're looking at this morning, because of that, Ahimelech dies. In fact, all the priests that serve with him, except for one, they die because of what David did here. Now, while even David himself, at the end of 1 Samuel 22, even though David himself sees him connected in some way connected or even responsible in some way for the death of the priests at the hand of Saul, that interpretation of what happened is saying more than the text says. We're going to see that as we look at that next, over the next couple of weeks. But what happened here, by emphasizing that the death of the priests after this and laying that at David's feet puts the emphasis on something different than the text says. Although 1 Samuel 21 doesn't mention it, or at least not in the verses that we have, in 1 Samuel 22, both Doeg and Ahimelech say that David came to inquire of the Lord. The high priest, Ahimelech, would have had what's called the Urim and the Thummim. They were used by the high priest, and the Lord would use that and speak to the people. He would bring revelation. You'll see that in numerous places in Scripture. The high priest uses the Urim and the Thummim and brings special revelation from God. So they go to God to hear him speak. David is not relying on his own cunning. He is coming to the Lord to hear. 1 Samuel 21 marks a new stage in David's life. It's the beginning of his wanderings after being exiled from the court of Saul. It's wandering that will continue for the rest of the book of 1 Samuel until the death of Saul. You have to understand, David, during this season of his life, is alone and he's hunted. 1 Samuel 19, at the end of that, he leaves Samuel. At the end of 1 Samuel 20, there's that whole story about Jonathan trying to help David figure out whether or not Saul actually wants to kill David, right? With the boy and the arrows. It's a great story. Like if you read there, you see this account of how Jonathan cares about David and he finds out from Saul. But you have that at the end of 1 Samuel 20, David and Jonathan part. likely thinking they will never see each other again, with tears. So he's alone, and he is an enemy of the king, Saul, who was powerful and who was vicious in his anger. David was a competitor to the throne. Saul knew he had been anointed. Saul knew he was the man after the Lord's own heart, the man who would replace him, and he wants him dead. And so this period in David's life, this season, was probably the lowest point in his life, but it was also a season that produced some of his most well-known psalms. And as I said earlier, we know that because it's specifically mentioned. Written when he was with the Philistines in Gath and pretended to act insane. Written when he was in the wilderness of Judea. Written while he was in the cave. Written, like Psalm, I'm going to list them here. Psalm 7, Psalm 18, Psalm 56, Psalm 34, Psalm 45, Psalm 34, Psalm, it says 452. I'm thinking those three numbers are somehow involved, but there's only two of them. So I have to double check. I believe it's 52. Yes, Psalm 52, Psalm 57, Psalm 63, Psalm 142. Like you just see, and it's not like we're guessing. It's written in the superscription, the title above the psalm. And as you read through these psalms, we just sang one of them, Psalm 63. You see something of David's mind and his heart during this season. He was wandering. He was seeking God, looking for God, longing for God, looking for refuge, and finding it. He was wandering, but he was not lost. And what we're going to see over the next few weeks is we're going to see, today we're going to look at David as seeker, but we're going to see David as sojourner, as shelter, as strengthened by Jonathan, as savior, as a would-be savior who tries to save Saul's life twice, stumbling. But through it all, he knows who he is and to whom he belongs. And what we're going to see is him being reminded of that again and again and living that out. And so he begins his wanderings, and he is in need of direction from the Lord, and also in need of food and a weapon in order to defend himself. And so he comes to Ahimelech the priest at Nob. It's kind of on the way. If you had a map, you see that he came from Ramah, which is north. And then he went to Gibeah, which is where Saul, like Jerusalem wasn't the capital of Israel yet, but Gibeah was where Saul had his court. And then just below that is Nob, and that's on the way to Gath. Scratch that. Contemporary news is getting to my head. Gath, not Gaza. But, so it's kind of on his way, but you have to think, the place where the priests are is kind of an odd place to go for food and a weapon. But he goes there, and so it might not be great for food and for weapons, but it's a great place to hear from the Lord. And so it may have been incidental that it was on the way, but everything points to this being intentional, perhaps on David's part, but certainly on the Lord's part. There's many questions and ambiguities and difficulties with what happens in this season of David's life. I'm just going to highlight some of them because we're going to look at them over the next few weeks. But why was Ahimelech afraid? Why does David come to the house of the Lord and the high priest? Why does he go to the Philistines, to Achish, the king of Gath, which, by the way, was Goliath's hometown? And what's he dragging along behind him? The sword of Goliath, who's from their town. Like, why on earth would he go with the sword of the guy he killed from that town? Like, why? That's a question. Why does he go to Moab? Like if you're, kids, you're familiar with the story of Ruth? It's a great story. The woman, where does she come from? She comes from Moab. And who's her great-grandson? David. If you read the beginning of the book of Ruth, you'll see that staying in Moab, not a great time for David's family. A lot of death. Yes, it ends with Ruth coming back to Israel, but it wasn't a great decision and it wasn't a great time. Why on earth would he send his parents there? There's all kinds of things. And we'll look at all that. We'll work through that as we go through these chapters through this series. But if we get past those questions for a moment and we just look at our passage here, 1 Samuel 21, 1-9, what do we see? David received two things at the end of this passage. The bread that spoke of the promise of God's presence, the Lord's presence. And he received a sword that reminded him of the Lord's deliverance. David begins his wanderings, but he's not lost. And he begins by seeking God's presence and seeking God's deliverance. And he finds it. And so we're going to begin, we're going to look at the two things. First, we're going to look at the promise of the Lord's presence. So David comes to Ahimelech, who's trembling with fear. This is the highest guy, major general in Saul's army, but he's on his own. And he tells Ahimelech a lie. Like it's an outright lie. And he asks for something to eat, for food, for bread. It's likely that this story was not meant to deceive Ahimelech or trick Ahimelech, but rather an attempt to protect him. Like it's clearly a lie. Perhaps you know stories from World War II. There's perhaps people that are related to people here. During the World War II, they hid Jews in their house. Or they hid soldiers, Allied soldiers in their house. And if a German came to the house and said, "Is there a Jew in your house?" And they would go, "Yes, he's right there." No, they would say, "No, there's not." They would lie to protect life, right? So on the one hand, you can say that David is lying to protect Ahimelech. What he needed to do is he needed to protect him from Doeg. That's the problem. David comes to this place where the priests are. It's likely not the tabernacle. The tabernacle was likely destroyed in 1 Samuel 4. But it's a tent. It's a place where the priests are carrying out the worship of God, the sacrifices and all. And Doeg's actually there, detained before the Lord. But Doeg's the problem. He wasn't supposed to be there. And it would explain Ahimelech's fear and David's story. Doeg was an official in Saul's service. He was his chief shepherd. And so what you have is Ahimelech is afraid of Saul. And so David tells this story, which, by the way, is a horrible story. Like, do you ever have that where, I know I've had that where I tell a story. I remember as a kid or even as a young man, I tell a story to explain what I was doing, and the people looking at you are like, that is such a, you're a horrible liar. Not horrible like a sinful lie. No, you're just really bad at this. This is a bad story. You got secret instructions and your men are hidden somewhere else? Really? That's what we're going with? But Ahimelech takes it. But he does it to protect Ahimelech, although David doesn't realize how vicious Saul will be in his response. But Ahimelech gives David the bread of the presence. Now, this is a big deal. What you have is the bread of the presence there's these 12 loaves of bread that were put out before the Lord on a table, 12 loaves, one for each tribe. And this bread pointed to, it's almost like God was having a meal with his people. Right? It's bread that spoke to fellowship. It pointed to the manna that fed them in the wilderness. It pointed to their covenant relationship with God. It's though God is in his tent, in his house, was having fellowship with his people. And that bread would be put out every Sabbath. And Leviticus 24, 5-9, it could only be eaten by the priests and in a holy place. So there's a question. Why did Ahimelech think that he could give that bread to this David? Ahimelech makes sure that David and his men are ceremonially clean, which is in connection with the law. They needed to be ceremonially clean, kept from women. So he does that, but then he ignores the part about it only being for the priests and only in a holy place. Now we know from the Lord Jesus, Luke 6, if you've got a Bible, you can see it, you can read along, or you can check this, but Luke 6, 3 through 5, Jesus is being confronted by the Philistines, or the Pharisees. He's being confronted by the Pharisees about his disciples picking grain as they're walking on the Sabbath and then, crushing the grain and eating it while they walk. And what Jesus says in Luke 6, verses 3 and 4 is he said, haven't you ever heard about what David did and his companions? His men, he entered the house of God. He took the consecrated bread, the holy bread. He ate what is only lawful for the priest to eat. So Jesus is affirming that Ahimelech did something that was correct. Now, in part, it could be that Ahimelech was justified in giving this bread because it was for a special circumstance, and that Jesus is confirming that this was the proper way. Like, David was in trouble, he needed food, and so the law about, this only being for the priests and being eaten in a holy place, that can be superseded by the need of the person in front. And that's fair. Jesus often does that in the Gospels. He connects, or he corrects, the overzealous and wrong-minded contrived ideas and laws and regulations that were placed on top of the Word of God and the law of God. You read through Matthew 5 and 6, you see Jesus doing that. You have heard it said, but I say to you. He speaks, Matthew 23 about, the weightier matters of the law. You tithe your mint and your herbs and all that stuff, but you ignore the weightier parts of the law. He speaks about, how love for God and love for your neighbor means that in some situations you do something that the law says not to do. For instance, if your donkey falls in a pit on the Sabbath, of course you work and you get it out of the pit, right? So Jesus says that, so there is a sense in which we can say, okay, this is David being in need, and so the requirements of the law can be bent in some way or form out of a love for neighbor. But there's something more. In Luke 6, verse 5, if you're in Luke 6, you can see it. Jesus keeps going, because what he says is not that. It's not just that, okay, the law is followed, but there's certain situations where you need wisdom to know how to apply the law in situations. He's not saying that. He says, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So what Jesus is saying is that his disciples are able to take grain and crush it and eat it, which is in some way a violation, I suppose, of working on the Sabbath, right? But he says the basis for them being able to do that is not because, hey, they're really hungry, they're famished, and they need to have these little pieces. No, he's saying they can do it because of my person, because of who I am. His person. So Ahimelech was justified in giving the bread, the holy bread, the bread of the presence, both because of David's situation and need, but also because of David's person. He was the anointed one, the Messiah. This is the bread that the Lord provides for David. Think that through. It's as though the Lord was saying to David, I don't know that David thought he was going to get the bread of the presence. But he comes to Ahimelech, and the Lord says, this is the bread that you get. You, David, my anointed, the man after my own heart, you need to feed on this bread at this moment. You need the bread. You need bread not only feeds your body, but which points you to me and the promise of my presence and my provision for you. You, David, need this right now in your wanderings. And so David leaves the tent of the Lord. He leaves with the bread of the Lord's presence, confirmed in who he is as God's anointed, confirmed in God's plan of redemption and his place in it. He's fed by the bread that is a promise of God's covenant with his people, of God's being with his people. You know, in a sense, you could say that David came to the priest of the Lord, and he received more than just provision from the priest. He received something. He received provision from Jesus, his Son. Jesus, the incarnate Son of God, born into the line of David. Jesus, the bread that came down from heaven, the better manna. Jesus, the one who let his own body be crucified and who took bread on the night he was betrayed and broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you." 1 Corinthians 11:24. Jesus, the bread of life, who says, "All who hunger, come to me." And receive God's provision, receive life. Jesus, who was recognized by the disciples after the road to Emmaus, when he broke bread with them. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who left the presence of his Father in heaven to take on our human nature, and who took on that human nature to be denied that presence and provision of God on the cross, who cried out on the cross, Matthew 7:46, my God, why have you forsaken me?" David came in his need. He would have felt forsaken. And he comes in God's providential care to the house of God and to the priest, and the food he receives is the bread of the presence of God, the God of Israel, the Lord, bread that pointed to his Son, the one who would be forsaken so that he would never be forsaken. That's provision. David's wandering, but he seeks and he finds the Lord, a promise of his presence. If you're here today, right now, and you're wandering, or you're lost, maybe God's leading you through a valley of faith, a valley of experience, a valley of just conflict or of sorrow, but you're wandering. Seek him, and you will find him. It may not be what you were expecting. It may not be in the way you were expecting. But seek him, and he will be found. Because he's seeking you, and he will find you. And in your seeking, would that you would find Jesus. That you would find the one who wandered this life, this earth, to take on our sin and our shame, to die our death, who was a wanderer in this world, who had no place to put his head, but who died for our sins to bring us close to God, to his presence. Would you find him? Would you be found by him in your wandering and your seeking? And would that mean that you would wander and never be lost? That's first, a promise of the Lord's presence. Second, a reminder of the Lord's deliverance. Because David also seeks a weapon, an instrument of deliverance, and he finds that here as well. You know, some think it's a coincidence that Goliath's sword happened to be there, but it's possible that David knew it was there. If you're familiar with the story of David and Goliath, you can read about that in 1 Samuel 17. But David, as a young boy, he kills this Philistine champion, this massive guy named Goliath. And after that, he takes the weapons, the armor of Goliath, and he puts it in his tent. So he keeps them. But at some point, that sword, that armor, makes its way to the place of worship, to the house of the Lord. it's highly unlikely that David would have been unaware of this, that this trophy of victory over the Philistines that was his, that was in his house, his home, that it's no longer there and that he wouldn't know where it was. It's in this tent. So David likely would have known it was there. On top of that, going to the house of the Lord, going to a house of worship, typically not a great place to go for a weapon. I'm thinking there's better places you could go. And then notice what Ahimelech says. He doesn't just say, hey, Goliath's sword's here. No, he says, the sword of Goliath the Philistine who you struck down in the valley of Elah, behold, it is here, wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you will take it, for there is none but that here. Verse 9, verse 8 and 9. David knew what happened in the valley of Elah. He was there. But he is reminded of the incredible deliverance that happened. And then he is given the sword that was a trophy from the Philistine champion. He comes seeking a weapon, and a powerful weapon's there. But the power of that weapon is not in the holder of the weapon, but in the one who gave the victory, whereby David got the weapon. It's a trophy of God's deliverance, a remembrance of the Lord's deliverance of Israel that day. When Goliath came against David, when David came to him, David said, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. It is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord, and he will give all of you into our hands. Those words and that faith in the Lord's power and his deliverance are needed by David right now. And the sword is a remembrance of that. He didn't get a great weapon. He got a great reminder of the Lord who gave him that weapon. The future might be hidden from him. The threat of death might lay before him, but he knows what God is doing. God is with him and God is for him. He has his presence and his deliverance. And then this detail, this is magnificent. The sword is wrapped in a cloth and behind the ephod. What an interesting detail. The ephod was a garment. It was part of the garment of the high priest. It was kind of like a vest that he put on over his robes. And it had a compartment inside it that held the Urim and the Thummim. So like in the next chapter when David's going to get, when Ahimelech's going to die because of what's going on, it's because David came to inquire of the Lord. The ephod would have been the thing that Ahimelech would have had to put on to take out the Urim and the Thummim and speak from God. Like David would receive the sword of Goliath, but he would also receive another sword, the Word of God. God's means of deliverance, the reminder of God's deliverance in the sword, but also God's means of revelation, his Word. That's what David receives as well. A word that brings the promise of God's presence and his salvation. What a fascinating thing for David. Like he comes here for this, and this is what he gets. When you have this passage in mind when you read through some of David's Psalms. Psalm 34, verse 4, I sought the Lord and he answered me. He delivered me from all my fears. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Have this psalm in mind with Psalm 56, verse 3. When I am afraid, I will trust in you. In God whose word I praise. In God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? Psalm 52, 8. I am like a green olive tree in the house of the Lord. I trust in the steadfast love of God forever and ever. Psalm 63, verse 1. Oh God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you as in a dry and weary place. So I have looked upon you in your sanctuary, in your tent, beholding your power and glory. David comes to the priest and he receives the promise of God's presence and a reminder of his deliverance. And he receives in that a foretaste and a foreshadowing of what his great son will provide. David is the anointed, the king in waiting, but he's wandering and lost. And in his suffering, he points us ahead to Jesus. Like the longing that we have. We come to God in our need as those who belong to God, who belong to Jesus. And David was pointed forward, but in our need, in our wandering, we're pointed back. Isn't that awesome? Like David was pointed forward to things that were going to happen 1,000 years later. We in the present, in our wandering, we come to God in our time of need, and we're pointed back 2,000 years to when Jesus came and died and rose. To remembrance of what God did in Jesus. At the cross, we're told that the Lord fights our battles for us, that the battle is His, that the Lord is our helper. He is with you and He is for you. And He has stated that emphatically in Jesus Christ. There is none like Him. In your wanderings, seek Him and find Him. When you are lost, when you are afraid, you can trust in Him. It's going to be messy and broken and sad and confusing. It will be all of that for David. We'll see that in the next few chapters. But entrust your story to the one who's writing it. In your wanderings, seek and find Jesus. That in your greatest need, you would come to the realization that there is none but Him here. That you exhaust all other avenues. And like Ahimelech saying to David, the only thing that's here is the sword by which you slayed Goliath in the valley of Elah. There is none other here. That you would come to the Lord, exhausting all other avenues. And in your wanderings, God would say to you, my son is here. There is no other. No other deliverance. And that you would respond like David and you would say, there is none like Him. Give Him to me. And that's what David leaves. That he leaves the house of the Lord, having sought and found the God who was with him and who was for him. Amen. Let's now respond to the proclamation of the gospel by singing. And we're going to sing a psalm, Psalm 138. We'll sing stanzas 1 and 4.